What is it about Americans and Paris, or Americans and Tuscany, or most recently, apparently, Americans and Mallorca? Many Americans have long romanticized Europe as this jewel of ancient history and culture, but what even is Europe? What do people mean when they talk about it? Where is Poland? What about the Balkans? What about Turkey? Is that still Europe? And the question on everyone's lips, where does Russia fit into this? Isn't Russia also part of Europe as well? I'm originally from the UK. I've been living in Germany for over a decade, and these are some of the questions that I want to explore today, because if you ask 10 Americans to point to Central Europe on a map, you'll get 10 different answers. Most Americans, actually, I would say most people in general, like their mental map of Europe, at least people who are not from Europe themselves, it stops at France, Germany, and maybe Spain. Beyond that, it's just all this kind of vague blur of the East or Slavic or somewhere near Ukraine. And woe is the man who makes the mistake of calling a country Eastern Europe. Everyone seems to want to distance themselves from that label because it's not just a comment on their geography. It's a kind of code for less developed, ex-communist, and many countries want out of that category. Poland sees itself as Central Europe, so does Hungary, Austria, and even parts of Germany. But where does Central Europe end, and where do the Balkans begin? And why does nobody seem to agree? I guess the real question here is, how many Europes are there? It sounds simple enough, but it really isn't. If you ask a geographer, they'll tell you Europe stretches from Iceland in the west to the Ural Mountains in Russia. That's kind of the textbook definition. It's a subcontinent defined by tectonic plates and mountain ranges. But if you ask a politician, they'll probably say something about the EU, meaning the 27 countries with shared laws, open borders, and Brussels breathing down their neck. But then that excludes countries like Norway and Switzerland and Albania, and yes, even parts of the Balkans that desperately want into the EU. Now, if you ask somebody from the UK, depending on their age, of course, you might hear something like fog in the Channel, or Europe is over there somewhere. Like, quite honestly, this video is much for Brits as it is for Americans, because many Brits do not see themselves as being part of Europe at all. And if you don't understand this, I did a whole video on it here. You can check it out after this one up here. I'll link it somewhere. So which one is it? Geographical Europe is seemingly clear on paper. Political Europe is in flux, and cultural Europe is completely up for debate. And that's even before we get to emotional Europe. The one people imagine when they dream of sitting in a Parisian cafe, or eating Sachertorte in Vienna, or hiking the Alps, or sailing the Croatian coast. The one Hollywood romanticized for decades and that just doesn't really actually exist. There's no single definition of Europe. There really are quite a few, and some of them overlap, some contradict each other, and the confusion isn't just semantic. It shapes how nations see themselves and how others see them. And this is why countries like Georgia and Moldova and the Ukraine, they desperately want to be seen as European. And the complexity is increased by the sheer number of languages spoken here and the absence of any official common language across Europe. Learning German has been one of the most eye-opening experiences of my life, which is why I'm very excited to bring you LingoPie, who are kindly sponsoring this video. LingoPie offers a massive selection of your favorite shows and films with the ability to make use of incredible language learning tools. You can turn on German or English or both at the same time. If you hit a word you don't know, you just click it, there's an instant translation, and it's saved to the vocab list, so you can review it later for further study. What I like most about this is how flexible it is. You can slow down the audio when it's needed. You can follow along with a full transcript on the side, and if there's a sentence that's tricky, you could just loop it until it clicks. LingoPie has over 3,000 native shows and movies, but not only that, you can actually use its Netflix and Disney Plus extensions to enhance your learning. You can choose from German cult classics like Dark or Cleo, dramas like Oktoberfest, Beer and Blood, and if reality TV is your thing, they've got you covered. There's comedy, there's cooking, the list really goes on. And whether you're living in Germany or any other foreign country or not, this really is the perfect way to gain exposure to the language, to get accustomed to the different accents, and to expand your vocabulary and build up your personal bank of common phrases. Oh, and just in case German isn't enough for you, you will have access to many more other languages, including French, Spanish, Japanese, Korean, Portuguese, Italian, and many more. Click the link in the description below to start your 7-day free trial today. My link gets you an exclusive discount once inside. So, who belongs where? What is Western, Central, and Eastern Europe? This is where things really start to unravel. Like most Americans, quite frankly, most Brits, they will refer to everything east of Germany as Eastern Europe. Like Poland, Eastern Hungary, Eastern Romania, Bulgaria, and the Baltics, definitely Eastern Europe. Except they're not. I mean, at least not according to the people who actually live there. Ask a Pole or a Czech or a Slovak where they live, and they will probably say Central Europe. And this is not just a geographic correction, it's a cultural statement. You know, it's a way of saying we're not post-Soviet, we're not Balkan, we're not some eastern outpost of Europe, we're at its very heart. And this matters because, you know, these labels, Western, Eastern, and Central, are never neutral. They always come with baggage. Western Europe has long been synonymous with prosperity, with liberal democracy and modernity. And Eastern Europe still evokes the ideals of communism. It is just the fact that these countries feel different. Like even just walking around the city of Berlin, you can often feel the difference between West and former East Berlin, even though so much has changed since then. Central Europe tries to sidestep both stereotypes by reclaiming its medieval and Austro-Hungarian legacy, a legacy that predates the Cold War and often complicates the East-West binary even more. So what about the Balkans? Good luck getting a clear answer there. So geographically, the Balkans refer to the southeastern peninsula, countries like Serbia, Bosnia, Albania, and Bulgaria. But culturally and politically, it's a minefield. Like the term the Balkans was originally used by the Ottomans, which is the Turkish word for mountain, specifically like a chain of wooded mountains. And it was never really used by the locals themselves. And so for many in the West, the term Balkan often implies conflict, instability, ethnic tension, largely due because of the wars in the 90s. And so many people in the region, they really resent this label. Identity there is really complex, and not least of all because the borders have shifted so often. Like this is one of the things that makes comparing the US to Europe, as in US states to European countries, totally meaningless, because it's just such a different situation. And then there is, of course, the question of Russia and Turkey, and this is not even about Americans or Brits anymore. No one can seem to come to a consensus on this. If you ask 10 Europeans if Russia is part of Europe, then you will probably get 10 different answers, each tinged with history, ideology, and their own kind of trauma. You just can't get a yes or no answer. It always requires context and story. Like geographically, the answer is kind of a simple yes. But then again, not really, because only part of Russia, not the whole of it, is part of Europe. Only around 25% of Russia's landmass lies west of the Ural Mountains, which traditionally marks the boundary between Europe and Asia. And that portion includes cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg. These are cities which culturally have played a huge role in European history. But politically and psychologically, the question is really anything but simple. You know, for much of modern history, Russia has been Europe's great contradiction. A civilization that gave the West Tolstoy, Tchaikovsky, and Dostoevsky, while simultaneously terrifying it with Tsars, gulags, and tanks. Russia has always occupied a liminal space. It's too vast, too authoritarian, and just too other to be fully European, yet too historically intertwined to be excluded. And so even in the post-Soviet years, its position remained ambiguous. Then came Crimea and the Donbass, and suddenly for much of the West, the question wasn't, is Russia part of Europe, but should it be? Today, many Europeans, especially those in the Baltics, Poland, and the Nordics, they reject any notion of a shared European identity with Russia. The war in Ukraine didn't just redraw borders, it redrew Europe's moral map, and Russia, for many, now sits decisively outside of it. And then there's Turkey, another borderland nation caught between East and West, culturally rich, militarily strong, and historically enmeshed with Europe through the Ottoman Empire. And Turkey has long flirted with the idea of European belonging. It's even been a formal candidate for EU membership since 1999, still not been accepted, because as with Russia, the question is never just about geography, it's about values. It's about democracy, press freedom, human rights, and whether Turkey's political direction aligns with the EU's evolving identity. And so this is really the crux. Europe is not a neutral geographic concept. It's a story we tell about ourselves, and like all stories, it includes and excludes based on who's doing the telling. And so just to boil this down, I would say there are at least 3 different Europes, and most people kind of mix them up without realizing it, and that's why there's so much confusion. So there is geographical Europe, political Europe, and cultural Europe. So on paper, Europe is a continent, but it's a strange continent, more like a peninsula than a landmass attached to Asia and sharing the vast Eurasian land plate. And that's why definitions vary. Some exclude the Caucasus nations like Georgia and Armenia, others debate whether Cyprus, closer to Syria and Greece, should even count, and even the UK, like post-Brexit, is often spoken of as if it just drifted off into the North Atlantic. So geography alone is just not enough to explain Europe. It's not enough. You have to then go into political Europe, which is very confusing. There's the EU, which is the most ambitious political project the world has ever seen, but being in Europe doesn't mean being in the EU. Norway, Switzerland, and Iceland are not EU members, but they are unequivocally European, both in identity and alignment. Meanwhile, you have countries like Turkey and several Balkan states. They have been EU candidates for decades, but, they still haven't crossed the threshold into the EU. Then you've got NATO, a separate alliance with its own geography. Turkey is in NATO, but not in the EU. Austria is in the EU, but not in NATO. Finland and Sweden recently joined. Ukraine wants to join. Russia is doing everything to prevent that from happening. So the politics get really very messy very quickly, and political Europe is very different to geographical Europe. And finally, there's cultural Europe. Perhaps this is the hardest to define and the most emotionally charged. This is the Europe of Beethoven and Dante, of liberal democracy and secular values, of Christmas markets and university towns and high-speed trains. It's the imagined community that tourists dream of and politicians invoke. But it's also where the deepest tensions lie. Everyone talks about the US as being this amazing melting pot of multicultural immigration, which it's not false, but what about the cultural and political entity of Europe? Like, nothing like that has ever been tried in the history of the world. Like, the idea that you can just look past years and years of war and destruction and shifting borders, like, that actually goes against human nature, and that is what makes it so special. The problem is, who gets to define European values? Is it the bureaucrats in Brussels? Is it the Catholic heartlands of Poland, or is it the post-national elites in Paris and Berlin? When Hungary or Italy moves to restrict migration, are they defending Europe or are they betraying it? Is Europe Christian? Is it secular? Is it multicultural, postmodern? No one really agrees. But at least for the moment, this is a battle of ideas, not bodies. And that was kind of the whole point of the EU. So if you are American, don't worry, you're not alone in finding Europe very confusing. It is just very difficult to define, and everything we've discussed here just makes it so elusive. It's not a single civilization, but a palimpsest, layer upon layer of contradiction. You've got Catholic and Protestant, Latin and Slavic, liberal and authoritarian. It's a place where boundaries have shifted so often that some villagers have changed countries several times without ever moving. And yet there is something distinctly European in the very awareness of these contradictions, like the ability to hold multiple identities in tension. The very idea that you can go supranational is very European. No one else has even conceived of trying to attempt this. We'll obviously see what happens if it actually works, but to sit in a cafe in Paris and critique the entire system in 5 languages with 3 passports in your back pocket, that is the very essence. The very idea of Europe is, and I think always has been, a debate. That's what makes it so frustrating to outsiders and fascinates those who stay, because it's really alive and it's changing all the time. And so why does any of this matter, especially to someone from Austin or Alberta or Manchester? Why does this matter? Because the story of Europe is still the story of the West. It was European thinkers who exported ideas like rationalism, nationalism, capitalism. It was European wars that shaped the current world order that we have today. And it's European integration that set the template for post-war peace, and European disintegration that signals its potential unraveling. And so when Europe struggles with its identity, it reveals cracks in the broader Western psyche. And so Europe is often the first place where cultural tremors are felt. The rise of the far right, the backlash against globalism, the decline of religion, the loneliness epidemic, the bureaucratic bloat, these are not just European stories, they are canaries in the coal mine of modern liberal democracies. What happens in Sweden's elections, in Poland's courts, or on the French streets during a pension protest ripples far beyond the borders of Europe. And so, I have a tendency to go a little too deep with these topics. But if you're American, this might seem like overthinking, but in Europe, identity is largely inherited. It's not chosen. Like, we don't really have anything like the American dream. And whether you believe that the American dream is dead or alive, the fact that that idea exists is incredible. And so if you really want to understand Europe, you can't stop at croissants in Paris or castles in Bavaria. You really have to go deeper and ask deeper questions like, where do the Balkans begin and end? Why do some Poles bristle at being called Eastern European? What does it mean to be European in a world where global power is shifting to the East? And perhaps the most important question of all, can a continent built on division ever find unity without losing its soul? That's really the tension that defines Europe, and it's the reason why understanding it matters now more than ever before. If you're American or British or from anywhere else across the world, I highly encourage you to come and visit some European countries. Thank you so much for watching. I appreciate all of you. Take it easy, and I will see you in the next one. Bye-bye.